By the late 20th century, Angola had become one of the most fiercely contested proxy battlegrounds of the Cold War. Following centuries of Portuguese colonial rule, Angola's independence in 1975 had not brought peace but rather plunged the nation into a civil war of astonishing complexity and brutality. Three liberation movements, the MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, vied for control, but it was the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, with backing from the Soviet Union and Cuba, that seized the capital Luanda and declared itself the legitimate government. South of Angola, apartheid South Africa viewed the rise of a Marxist government as an existential threat. Angola provided sanctuary to the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, which was fighting to end South African rule in Namibia, then Southwest Africa. To counter MPLA and SWAPO influence, South Africa threw its support behind UNITA, led by the charismatic Jonas Savimbi, and repeatedly intervened militarily. By the mid-1980s, the stage was set for a confrontation of unprecedented scale on the African continent. In 1987, the MPLA launched a major offensive to destroy UNITA's strongholds in Angola's southeast. Supported by Cuban advisors and Soviet arms, MPLA's military wing, FAPLA, People's Armed Forces for the Liberation of Angola, assembled over 20,000 troops, T-55 and T-62 tanks, BM-21 Grad rocket launchers, and MiG fighter jets. Their target was UNITA's de facto capital at Jomba, a remote base near the Namibian border. If Jomba fell, UNITA's insurgency would collapse. But as FAPLA advanced, they encountered stiff resistance from UNITA fighters and their South African allies. The South African Defense Force, SADF, with fewer than 5,000 troops in Angola, responded with Operation Modular, deploying long-range artillery, mobile armored units, Raitels and Oliphant tanks, and Mirage fighter jets. The two forces clashed at the Lomba River in September and October 1987. In these battles, SADF's superior tactics and technology told. FAPLA units, advancing without adequate reconnaissance, were decimated by precision South African artillery strikes. Soviet-made tanks bogged down in swampy terrain, becoming easy targets. By October, FAPLA's offensive collapsed. Thousands of MPLA soldiers were dead or missing, and over 150 Soviet-supplied tanks lay destroyed or abandoned. The shattered remnants of FAPLA retreated to the town of Cuito Cuanavale, hoping to regroup. Cuito Cuanavale, a small settlement with an airstrip and a strategic crossing over the Cuito and Cuanavale rivers, now became the focus of the war. South African and UNITA forces pursued the retreating FAPLA troops, aiming to destroy them entirely and neutralize the threat. But Cuba's response transformed the conflict. Alarmed by the MPLA's near collapse, Fidel Castro ordered a massive military reinforcement, Operation Maniobra XXXI. By late 1987, Cuba had airlifted thousands of fresh troops, T-55 and T-62 tanks, MiG-23 fighter jets, and state-of-the-art anti-aircraft systems into Angola. The Cuban force in Angola swelled to nearly 50,000 troops, the largest overseas deployment in Cuba's history. As South African G5 and G6 artillery pounded Cuito Cuanavale, Cuban and FAPLA engineers constructed intricate minefields, defensive bunkers, and anti-tank ditches. Air battles raged overhead as Cuban MiGs squared off against South African Mirages and Buccaneers. From January to March 1988, the SADF launched a series of attacks, Operations Hooper and Packer, aiming to breach the defenses. Fierce tank battles ensued in the swamps and savannas surrounding Cuito. But the combination of Cuban air superiority, minefields, and dogged FAPLA resistance stalled the advance. The once mobile South African forces found themselves bogged down, unable to achieve a breakthrough. While defending Cuito, Cuba prepared a daring counteroffensive. Tens of thousands of Cuban and Angolan troops began moving south and west, threatening South African positions near the Namibian border. The potential of a Cuban advance into Namibia itself alarmed Pretoria. For the first time, the apartheid regime faced the real possibility of a full-scale war on its own doorstep. South African troops at the front became increasingly cautious. The risk of escalating into a direct confrontation with Cuba, and by extension the Soviet Union, was too great. Meanwhile, the SADC's political masters in Pretoria faced growing international pressure. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and domestic unrest strained South Africa's ability to sustain its military adventures. Cuito Cuanavale became synonymous with devastation. The surrounding countryside was littered with burned-out tanks, shattered armored vehicles, and unburied bodies. Landmines laid in massive quantities rendered the land unusable for decades. Casualties mounted on all sides. MPLA Cuban forces estimated 4,000 to 10,000 dead or wounded. SADF UNITA forces, around 500 dead, many more wounded. Civilians, tens of thousands displaced, villages destroyed, farmland abandoned. Angolan civilians paid the highest price, caught between warring armies and aerial bombardments. By August 1988, all sides were exhausted. Behind closed doors, the United States and Soviet Union pushed for a settlement. The Tripartite Accord, signed in December 1988 by Angola, Cuba, and South Africa, ended foreign military involvement in Angola and paved the way for Namibia's independence. Cuban troops began withdrawing in 1989, and South African forces pulled out of southern Angola. Though UNITA remained active for years, the withdrawal marked the beginning of the end of Angola's proxy wars. The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale remains deeply symbolic. For Cuba and the MPLA, it was a decisive victory, a David and Goliath moment in which a small Caribbean nation helped defeat apartheid South Africa and imperialist designs. Nelson Mandela himself said Cuito Cuanavale marked the turning point for the liberation of our continent and my people. For South Africa, it was a strategic stalemate. The SADF had prevented the MPLA from annihilating UNITA but failed to capture Cuito and now faced an emboldened Cuban presence. For Angola, the war's legacy was one of destruction. Millions of landmines, a shattered economy, and deep social scars would plague the country for decades. Cuito Cuanavale is often called Africa's Stalingrad, a battle that shifted momentum in a larger war. It ended South Africa's aura of invincibility, accelerated Namibia's independence, and foreshadowed the eventual collapse of apartheid. Yet the human cost was staggering. The ruins of Cuito and the surrounding minefields stand as mute witnesses to one of Africa's most significant and costly battles.